Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
Do UFO sightings give new depth to the term Russian meddling? How many sightings during the Cold War were actually Soviet tricks to test Western defenses? Did the Soviets try to recruit British and American contactees as spies?
Hello and welcome to the 823rd edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. Did I say 23rd or 823rd?
It should be 820.
I'm pretty sure I might have said 23rd. It is the 823rd.
And radio historians will curse you for generations.
I know, and I don't blame them. I am Ben, and those diplomatically sensitive questions came from my co-host, partner in the paranormal, and dad, Paul. And today we bring you a show on a seldom discussed subject with two distinguished names in the UFO field, and we welcome your calls today, 401-766-1240. That's the number from anywhere, or you can email Paul at BehindTheParanormal.com, or you can contact us via Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
Before we introduce our distinguished guest, we have what we were hoping would be a surprise. Excuse me, getting over a cold here. We were hoping to have in studio today, all the way from the vast northern forests of New England, one of our favorite guest co-hosts, Steve Laplume. Steve was a U.S. Air Force security policeman at RAF Woodbridge in Suffolk, England during the Rendlesham Forest Incidents of 1980 and 1981, often known as Britain's Roswell. Steve was a bit under the weather today, couldn't come down to the studio. However, we do expect him to call in, and we hope to have a really, really great dialogue on the subject of Soviet involvement in these bizarre sightings, etc. So let us move to our guest. And unless you live under a rock, you know about Nick Redfern. He's the author of more than 40 books on all areas of the paranormal. In the UFO realm, they include Men in Black, Women in Black, the Roswell UFO Conspiracy, and 365 Days of UFOs. Nick has graced our airwaves, both here at WOON and on CBS, many times over the years. He is a familiar face on television, including the BBC's Out of This World, the Sci-Fi Channel's Proof Positive, the History Channel's Monster Quest, America's Book of Secrets and UFO Hunters, the National Geographic Channel's Paranatural, and MSNBC's Countdown. Recently, Nick personally honored me by writing the foreword for my latest book, Dancing Past the Graveyard, released a few months ago. Nick's latest book, Flying Saucers from the Kremlin, released in June, is the subject of our discussion today. Nick's website is nickredfern40an.blogspot.com. Fortean being reference to Charles Fort, Fortean.
So, Nick Redfern, welcome back to Behind the Paranormal.
Hey guys, well thanks for having me on again.
Oh, well, it's always a pleasure to have you on. So, Nick, start us off with what you know about the Soviets and the UFO incidents of the 1940s and 50s, and maybe even before.
Well, I mean, as far as the Russians are concerned, and going back to the earliest years of the Cold War, they sort of ran several programs to essentially create paranoia and fear and hysteria by quite literally fabricating bogus UFO stories and spreading them here and there and trying to, in essence, have U.S. intelligence sort of running around like headless chickens by creating these psychological warfare programs and disinformation campaigns. And so, you know, it was our side's turn, if you like, to try and stop this from happening. But as I point out in the book, you know, there's 50 years worth, if not more, of attempts by the Russians to use the UFO subject as a means of, as I said, like psychological warfare and trying to create paranoia on the other side.
Sorry, Nick, we missed most of that because I got distracted doing something technical. Please, could you restart?
Oh, sorry, that's...
Yeah, no, that's no problem. Yeah. Do you want me to just start...
Pretend you didn't say it in the first place and just we'll have our listeners...
Okay, cool. All right. Well, yeah,
I might fire the producer here.
What's that?
I might fire the producer here.
All right.
Go ahead, Nick.
Okay. Well, the book's called flying saucers from the Kremlin, and it's basically a sort of 50, 60-year study of the ways and means by which the Soviets, at the height of the Cold War, essentially created bogus UFO stories, and they did so as a means to create paranoia and hysteria, and to have U.S. intelligence sort of running around like headless chickens. That was the goal of the Russians, and thankfully, we were able to see a lot of these Russian programs for what they were, but others were quite extensive and detailed, to the point where some of the stories that the Russians created in relation to UFOs are still talked about in ufology today, without people actually realizing that the stories originated in Russia rather than outer space.
Wow. Okay. Well, can you give us some specific cases of that?
Well, yeah. I mean, if we go back to the early years of ufology, and for people who don't know, that the term flying saucer was created in the summer of 1947. That's when a pilot named Kenneth Arnold had this strange encounter with like a squadron of UFOs over by Mount Rainier in Washington State. And the term flying saucer was quickly created, and, sort of like a new part of history began. Everybody's heard of flying saucers and UFOs today. Now, if you go sort of the early years of ufology, one of the biggest areas and most controversial areas was the realm of what had become known as the contactees. And the contactees were people who essentially claimed face-to-face contact with very human-looking aliens, usually out in sort of remote desert locations like California, Arizona, New Mexico, and so on. Now, what's particularly intriguing is that one of the most famous of all the contactees was a man named George Adamski. And George Adamski sort of defines these contactee encounters in the 50s. And according to Adamski, again, later in the desert, he had this strange encounter with this very human-looking alien, long blonde hair, and the alien and its cohorts as well, claimed that we all should follow their way of life and lay down our nuclear weapons and live in peace with everybody else. That was the essential theme of nearly all of the contactee type experiences. Now, what's particularly intriguing is that the FBI opened a surveillance file on George Adamski, which has now been declassified under the terms of the Freedom of Information Act. And that file, as of now, it's been built up over the years as the FBI have released more and more papers. But right now, the file on Adamski is just over 400 pages in length. And one of the reasons why the FBI's file on Adamski is so extensive is because in his early lectures and speeches and conferences, Adamski said that the aliens had sort of a communist-type government. And that kind of sounds like laughable today, like a joke. But back then, on his lectures and on his conference circuits, etc., he brought this up on pretty much every occasion, and he would say, well, they have a Russian-type environment, they have a communist government, and then he would say, and by the way, communism isn't that bad after all. That's what he was saying to American audiences. And the FBI got concerned that Adamski was using the UFO phenomenon as a means to be able to spread communism. That's what the fear, and the understandable fear of the FBI was.
Now, I remember those times.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was a kid.
Well, what's that?
I was a kid.
Oh, cool. But,
believe it or not, I was a kid once, yeah.
But one of the interesting things about all this is that if you look at the overall story, what we find is not just the concern that Adamski was sort of working, to spread communism and doing it under a UFO banner, so to speak. The other angle was that the FBI had suspicions that Adamski may actually have been in sort of cohorts with Russian agents operating in the US, and there was this. That was actually one of the big suspicions. Is this guy, talking about UFOs? Has he actually got sort of Russian comrades, so to speak? And now, if Adamski, was just speaking to, say, 20 people in a local library on a Sunday afternoon, I don't think anybody, even the FBI, I don't think anybody would really care about that. But that's not what happened. Adamski's first book, Flying Saucers Have Landed, which came out in '53, that sold in 6 figures. The conferences and lectures that he spoke at, they sold out. So in other words, the reason why Adamski was perceived as being a national security problem, quite literally, was because he was speaking to literally thousands and thousands of people, whether on the lecture circuit or people who read his books and so on. And that was the primary reason as to why not just Adamski, but many of the other early contactees were all had files open on them. George Van Tassel, who built the Integratron out in California, his FBI file's about 300 pages long. Orfeo Angelucci's was roughly 200. And the list goes on. And it was all because many of these contactees had this extreme left-wing communist view. And again, it's sort of fascinating part of early UFO history where the US intelligence agencies weren't just investigating UFO sightings, they were actually trying to figure out if someone from the Soviet Union was planning on trying to find ways to spread communism and do it under this angle of flying saucers.
Well, we should introduce our co-host who has joined us by phone. Steve Laplume, welcome to the show again.
Why, thank you.
Yeah, and audio's good. And Steve, as we introduced you earlier, Steve is one of our regular guest co-hosts, though not often enough, in our opinion. But we're glad to have him with us today. So we have the two of you fellows together here. And Steve, why don't you just cue us in briefly on the Rendlesham Forest experience, for which you were present at the base, and there were Soviet suggestions regarding the origin of that, and then maybe Nick could comment.
Yeah, and actually that's one of the main things that I was always interested in about this case is, we always heard that it wasn't a UFO. The stuff that they saw breaking up in the sky was actually a Soviet satellite that had come in and broken up, and we were picking it up, and that was kind of one of the main stories that would kind of account for some funny lights in the sky. So there was that going around. But, at the same time, Reagan gave a speech about external threats to the world and how we would probably all come together as one earthly family if we had an external threat. And I often wondered if the Rendlesham Forest incident maybe got our side talking to their side a little bit about stuff like that, I was just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've heard that story as well, Steve, about, the Russian satellites sort of, coming through the atmosphere and breaking up and so on. It's an interesting scenario with the time frame. I guess the big issue, the people who sort of, take the alien angle would say, well, then what was the craft in the woods,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Rather just pieces
it makes for a good cover-up story.
What's that?
I said it makes for a good cover-up story is kind of the point I was getting. Yeah.
And I think what's fascinating about the Rendlesham case is that there actually are several different theories that have been put forward, as well as the Russian one. There's the UFO angle. I've heard stories about sophisticated hologram technology designed to see how people could be lured into sort of a fake scenario by seeing these incredible holograms that really didn't exist, in a physical sense. And it wouldn't surprise me if at least some of these different scenarios were sort of put out there to try and confuse researchers from getting too close to the truth. You swamp a bunch of UFO researchers with 6 or 7 different theories, they're going to be running around like headless chickens trying to get the answers, and maybe the real answer would be buried in these other sort of 7 or 8 cases. I think that's a good possibility.
I'm thinking of a show, fellows, that we did some years ago with Monroe Nevels, who was an Air Force security. Actually, he was the disaster specialist on the base. Steve, am I wrong?
Yeah. He's the guy that was in charge of the Geiger counter. Basically.
Exactly, and he came in afterwards and took readings of where the landing had occurred, things of this kind. And he has been on the show a number of times. A couple times you've been on together with him, Steve, I believe, when we were doing that series about 10 years ago.
Oh, when I was in China, yeah.
Yes. And his opinion was hands down that it was Soviet in origin, and very much along the lines of what some of the things Nick has suggested. Now, I kind of suspected there might have been people who have a religious agenda will sometimes want to go with the Soviet thing because it fits more with the scenario. Maybe they're right. I don't know, but are there any of the other witnesses, for either of you fellows, this question could go to, whom I maybe have forgotten about, who believe the Soviet explanation?
No, nobody I know.
Really? Okay.
Really think of that. No,
I don't. I mean, the only thing I know about the Russian story or the Russian theory is what I've read in books on Rendlesham.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
All right, so let's move on to and Steve, jump in here when you're not in the studio, so I can't see your hand. Oh, Ben wants to get in here.
So
I forgot about Ben.
Yeah, no, I'm here.
Sorry about that.
So we had Kathleen Martin on probably about a month or 2 ago, and she's big into contactee experiences and has it's like something like 6,000 cases.
Oh, it's amazing
that she's researched and worked on, and she just gets more and more every day. And I think it's interesting when we talk about contactee experiences, pre 1990, 1980, when the sort of experience of someone who has been abducted, it kind of gets the spotlight rather than the machine itself. And you see where I'm going with this. Since a lot of people were more into the idea of, there's flying saucers, but nobody really cared about contact, and people, if they brought it up, were just kind of, shoot off and said, you're crazy, or whatever. So my question is this. From what we know, the experiences that were had by contactees that were then played off as communist sympathizers, were these experiences recorded, and did they differ from any of the experiences that have been recorded today?
Well, certainly if you go back to the 1950s cases, they were sort of far more quaint and bizarre in the sense that, the contactees were talking about meeting human-looking aliens from Mars and from Saturn and Jupiter, and, and they'd have bizarre titles, like Captain this or Colonel that. It was like really something just straight out of a world of sci-fi. And if you read the stories, there's literally, which I don't in many of the cases, I think there have been these contactee experiences, but I think the mindset of the witnesses, the people who had these encounters, I think you can look at a lot of the cases and realise that to a degree, some of them, the people had their minds sort of altered. This sort of brings things in, like, for example, with Orfeo Angelucci, who was one of the 1950s contactees. He said that he believed, to start with, that his encounters were the real deal. He'd met these sort of human-looking aliens and had these philosophical conversations, and and debates about nuclear war and all this kind of thing. But over time, he came to suspect, that's probably the best word to describe him, he came to suspect that his mind had been sort of manipulated on several occasions. One famous case, or famous example, when he was in a diner out in California, and he talked about how this guy who called himself Adam slipped a pill into his drink on the table, and in no time at all he started to hallucinate, and it was almost as if he'd been hit by LSD or something, at least similar, you know, like a psychedelic solution. And and what's particularly intriguing is that on several occasions Angelucci talked about how a mysterious group of Russian people tried to get him to talk about the contactee issue from a communist angle, and to spread in his lectures that, you know, communism's great. And, you know, if we look at that today, that sounds quite plausible. Back then, people were just saying, you know, you're crazy. But, you know, what we know with sort of manipulation and things like that by the Russians, you know, for me, the Angelucci story is one of the most important, because you have him talking about being approached by these groups of like 4 or 5 Russian guys saying, you know, can you, we've come to some of your lectures and conferences, we like them, we like what you're talking about, but can you put more of a left wing, not so much left wing, I shouldn't say that, but more of a communist based angle. And he wouldn't do it. But then, you know, when he was hit with these sort of psychedelic drugs and what sounds like mind control, something similar to MK Ultra in the 50s, then you begin to realize that some of these bizarre contactee cases from the 50s may not have literally occurred as the contactees assumed they did. It may actually have been a widespread, sophisticated program to affect the mindsets of the contactees, and, as I said, have them to spread the word that, you know, communism's great and capitalism should be banned, you know, that kind of thing.
Mm.
Well, it's interesting because some of the contactee, you know, experiences, some of our close friends, they have these philosophical, you know, everything's united, equal, you know, everything's all one, and I wonder if a message like that, say someone has it as a legit, you know, contact experience where it's not, you know, Soviets trying to do mind control, but say, you know, hey, nuclear war is obviously bad, you know, we don't want to destroy the planet, or, you know, some messages that would have been construed as like hippy dippy kind of stuff. would that have been, you know, misconstrued as communist sympathizings?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good point, because, you know, it very much can kind of go both ways, you know, in terms of how you interpret this. And I mean, a classic example of this is the Aetherius Society, which has been around for, like, I think 60 years now, which is very much like a contactee-driven organisation that was created back in the 50s in the UK, but which now has its headquarters in California. And just a few years ago, under the terms of the British Freedom of Information Act, a group or an organisation within the British police force called Special Branch, which has now been absorbed into another group, just a few years ago, Special Branch declassified its files on the Aetherius Society. And the reason why they had quite a lengthy file on the group, which was created by a guy named George King, the reason why Special Branch opened this top secret file on the Aetherius Society was because the Aetherius Society were also saying, you know, we need to lay down our atomic weapons, or we're going to have like a face-to-face confrontation with the Russians, and everybody's going to lose, you know, which would be the case if we ever went to war. You know, no one can win a nuclear war. It's impossible. And so what happened was they created this file on the Aetherius Society for one primary reason, that the Aetherius Society was saying, look, you know, it's all going to go bad unless we all become friends, and, the Russians aren't so bad after all, etc., etc. And again, the same situation with the FBI in the United States. Special Branch started to have agents sitting in the audiences at the Theory Society's conferences and lectures. Sometimes they would put lectures on out in the streets in London, and the guys would be sitting in the audiences taking notes, etc., etc. And you can tell from the files again that with the Theory Society there was this concern on the part of Special Branch. Well, are these guys just people who are worried about nuclear war, or are they being subtly and secretly manoeuvred by the Soviets as a means to try and influence the UK population to think, well, maybe it's not so bad in Russia, maybe communism isn't the worst thing on the planet. And those, again, were sort of the primary reasons why Special Branch and the FBI in the US opened the files. Now, you could say, well, is this just government paranoia worrying, about a Russian threat that isn't real? But the more you dig into it, you do find hard evidence that the Russians did infiltrate both UK and US UFO research groups as a means, again, to just, kind of have people think about communism and do it, by saying, well, if it's good enough for the aliens, it should be good enough for us, that kind of.
Okay, well, I'd like to expand this discussion when we come back from our break, but right now we're going to take our bottom of the hour break. You're listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on WOON 1240 AM and 99.5 FM in New England's beautiful Blackstone River Valley, with our amazing guest today, Nick Redfern, and our special guest co-host, Steve Laplume. We'll be right back.
Did you know that in the 1960s, 92% of Americans listened to local radio every week? What do you think it is now?
I bet it's a lot less.
Would you believe that it's still 92%?
Wait, you mean more people listen to radio than TV?
Yes, more people use local radio every week than any other device.
I know I listen. I just didn't realize that everyone else does too.
92% of Americans listen every week. You are right now. Thanks.
You can depend on us for public service. ON Radio.
Okay, welcome back to Behind the Paranormal. It is WOON 1240 AM and 99.5 FM. And we are continuing our discussion on flying saucers from the Kremlin today with the author of that book and our good friend Nick Redfern, and also our special guest co-host Steve Laplume, who was present on in Britain at the NATO base UFO incident in Rendlesham Forest in 1981. And then Steve, jump in here anytime you want to ask a question, but I'd like to expand the discussion to involve everybody blames the Russians for everything, and as Ben just said during the break, they are very, very good at, what did you say, Ben? It was very well put.
What did I say?
No, I think you were the old guy.
Well, it's ironic because the Soviets, once they finally got themselves established, they pretty much set out plans to infiltrate every area of society, and the Communist Party, and the Socialists specifically, were very good at that. Like in the 1930s, they successfully inserted themselves into most American political parties. They successfully infiltrated the Catholic Church. They successfully infiltrated pretty much most areas of society. And it's ironic because a group that was all about, power to the working man and whatever was stuff that would be considered, basic human rights. They felt the need to infiltrate society and do all sorts of other stuff. They were the kings and queens of irony, but also they were incredibly good at, playing on people's emotions and morals.
So let's expand the discussion a little, unless Steve has a question on that very subject, to other groups who might have done this. Now, everything the Russians have done to us, we've been doing to them too, and the Brits and everybody has been doing each other, particularly West versus East, since at least the 1920s and probably since the 1890s or even before.
The socialists were all over the place.
Yeah. And the question is, what about, I mean, the Soviet Union has been gone essentially since 1991. The inheritor organizations of the KGB, and I want to get into that too, are still there, but it seems like China, you know, they're not pure as a driven snow. I mean, you'd think with the news coverage that they were. But Nick, what do you think about, or Steve, you lived in China. What do either of you think about Chinese interference via the UFO field? Is there any, and what is its nature?
Well, me personally, I actually, you know, there was a couple of prominent UFO sightings when I was over there, and we were really hard pressed to find anybody with any UFO research or anything, and I don't think they're really into that at all. They kind of believe it, kind of not. Yeah, you know, as far as the Chinese infiltrating like the UFO community and stuff, I don't even think that'd be a route they would go. But maybe I'm ignorant on that. Maybe they follow the Soviet, you know, pattern. But
yeah,
yeah. When it comes to stuff like that, superstition and religion, it's just like a path they don't really go down.
Well, I suppose, and maybe Nick could comment on this too, that it took a while for the Chinese to sort of get their act together because their revolution was way, way later than the Soviet one.
And also far longer.
Yeah, 1949, and yeah. So, Nick, what say you?
Oh, go ahead.
Nick?
What's that? Sorry?
Oh, sorry. No, what say you on the subject of China and any UFO influence?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of books that have been written on UFOs in China, but I have to say, kind of like with Steve, you know, I don't really have any evidence, you know, that in the way that the Russians, you know, launched these programs against the US in relation to UFOs. I haven't actually seen evidence that, you know, the Chinese have done something that kind of parallels that. So either they didn't do it, or it's been incredibly successfully buried, you know, and out of view. But I would have thought we would have had at least a few pinpoints, you know, of data that have surfaced. But other than literal sightings, you know, I'm not really aware of anything in terms of, you know, like the psychological warfare aspect of it all.
I think
Can I jump? I'm sorry, this is Steve. Can I jump in here with a?
Sure, Steve.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, it's just as you think of the time frame back then in the 50s and the, you know, with the Cultural Revolution in the 70s and everything, I don't think China was even capable of getting people there. I mean, they were a very close society up until the time that, you know, like the mid-70s. So that's a consideration as well.
Well, I think the landscape has changed a lot too, and you know, with the dawn of the internet, and you know, the amount of disinformation that we go through in 30 minutes is more than people went through in, you know, 30 days. It's the sheer amount of data that is shared all the time is just, it's incomprehensible. I think at the time, you know, the Soviets were in this sort of mode where, you know, the Cold War was a really fascinating sort of portion of history, because really it raged behind the scenes with all sorts of weird sort of backdoor wars, not including, you know, Vietnam and you know, Korea or any of those conflicts, like the sort of psychological damage that both sides wreaked on each other. That was just a whole. It was completely different. So something like, you know, psychologically damaging people for the sake of spreading communism was like, okay, yeah, you know, we can find some weird ways to do that. Let's do that. You know, let's infiltrate Hollywood. Let's do all of this stuff. And you know, it's interesting because, you know, we gave it right back to them. You know, McCarthyism is like a great you know, finger point to say, hey, you know, this is. You know, there was some stuff that was actually probably legitimate concerns, and then there was stuff that wasn't. Like, you know, pretty much everybody knows, and if you don't know, this is a really fun fact, that Invasion of the Body Snatchers was actually a metaphor for McCarthyism. And it's super interesting.
McCarthyism being Senator Joe McCarthy from Wisconsin going after any suspected communist influence in Washington, D.C. or anywhere in the country, the colleges or whatever.
Oh, yeah. And it was a big it was a metaphor for
in the 1950s. It was.
Yeah, I think it was like 1957.
And they hauled people before the House Un-American Activities Committee.
Yeah, it was super interesting.
The Senate, yeah.
Well, we spent like a good few weeks of that. I got lecture after lecture about it in college, ironically, and it was it was actually really interesting because it kind of shows the fear, right? That was surrounding this. I think that's a point that is often missed when people look back at like the watch out for the communists like kind of attitude. It was terrifying, right?
We were scared to death of the communists.
Yeah, I don't think anybody under the age of 30 really understands that.
Yeah,
and it was terrifying stuff that like at any point in time, a nuke could be sent. What's more terrifying than that? Being on the brink of destruction at all times, and then you have this weird clandestine program that's really all about taking something that could be a positive experience and then twisting it ever so slightly to ruin you and to ruin where you live, your home, your relationships with other people, and it shows the sort of stock that we put into these experiences, right? And it shows that some people would go as far to take something that could be a potentially life-changing experience, but then change it in a horrible and perverted way.
Well, this is totally off topic, but it's an interesting historical note. Sergei Khrushchev, the son of Nikita Khrushchev, lives here in Rhode Island. And Rhode Island being so small, everybody knows everybody else, so I actually was able to have a conversation with him at one point some years ago, and a very nice chap, a professor, engineer, and I said, I used to have to hide under desks because of your father. And he laughed. He said, well, really it wasn't funny. That they had just as much fear there as it did, but that's totally irrelevant to what we're talking about. Sorry.
No, it's basically what the point that I'm trying to get to is the atmosphere was ripe.
Yes,
for these sort of we want to influence the country. We want to do this, and then pointing at your enemies for what you're actually doing.
Yeah,
and it makes me wonder if the United States ever did anything like that.
Never.
The Soviet
We're
Union.
pure as the driven snow.
Well, I know that.
Yeah. Oh my God! Yes, I'm sure we are.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, that is stuff I can't say. Can say, but
right. Yeah.
That's fair.
You and me both.
Yeah, I mean, all you got to do is look at some of the stuff we pulled in Latin America.
Oh yeah.
Tell me about it. Yeah.
Definitely not sure it's true. So.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Oh no, not at all. It was a conflict. That's what it is.
Sure. Nick, any comments on that before we move on?
Yes, one I can think of, when you're talking about both sides doing this, one of the more interesting stories that reached me when I was doing the research on all of this was how it could potentially have tied in with the whole Area 51 Bob Lazar scenario. For people who don't know, Bob Lazar was this scientist who claimed to have worked out at Area 51 in the late 80s for a short period and claimed that there were UFOs stored there and so on. Now, one of the interesting theories that came to me was that, well, one of the best ways to perhaps freak out the Russians in the late 80s is to spread rumors that we have extraterrestrial technology, maybe even extraterrestrial weaponry, and it's stored out at Area 51, and you subtly, and maybe sometimes not quite so subtly, seed this story into the public domain and into pop culture before too long. Everybody knows about the stories of aliens at Area 51. But the scenario that was put to me was that this was actually a ruse, and that Lazar was not like a knowing player. He was like an unwitting player in this program designed to have people think that there are aliens at Area 51 when there actually aren't any aliens there. And the way it was explained to me, that it was twofold. At that same time, U.S. intelligence was concerned that there were significant numbers of Soviet or Russian agents in the U.S. So what's the best way to lure them in? How about telling them or putting this story out there that they're not going to be able to stay away from? Like the dangling carrot, that kind of thing. And the story as it was told to me was that a number of these Russian agents were successfully arrested and essentially turned. It was either that or you do 25 years in prison. And basically, they were sort of ordered by their Russian handlers, we need to know what's going on at Area 51. And it was kind of quite literally like the fish and the bait, and these Russian spies were captured or arrested, and without any real secrets ever being compromised. It was just a psychological warfare operation, creating bogus UFO stories at Area 51, and then sitting back and waiting for those Russian spies to get closer and closer to the base and find out what's going on, and then they pounce. And apparently it worked,
Well, here's the question of the hour, I suppose, and this is to both of you for your opinions. How do you tell which cases were influenced, came from the Kremlin, or really came from wherever these legitimate UFOs, so to speak, might come from?
Well, that's an important point, because I actually mentioned this at the very start of the book. No doubt in my mind that there is a genuine UFO phenomenon, whether it's extraterrestrial or multidimensional or whatever it is. To me, there's enough data, enough credible cases to suggest that there is a real phenomenon. But then, of course, the big problem is how do you differentiate between the real cases and what might actually be psychological warfare, disinformation programs, cases driven like that. So we need to be very careful when we look at all these stories throughout the last sort of 50, 60 years, and particularly throughout the Cold War, which were the real cases and which were the ones that were so successful that people still believed they were the real cases, but maybe they weren't. I mean, I mentioned at the start, like George Adamski. I mean, his FBI file, 400 pages long, because the FBI was concerned he was spreading communism under a UFO banner. Or was it really the case that he did meet aliens and they really were communists?
Yeah. That's true. Steve, any comment?
Yeah, if I can chime in on my 2 cents here. When it comes to disinformation, I think you can confirm this, Paul. I mean, that was kind of at its peak of art form back in the 80s. They were really getting into it a lot as far as spreading out a lot of stuff the intelligence communities were. So, I mean, how do you know what is a real case and not? I mean, I have a real case. I saw something. But what did I see? Did I see a hologram like Nick?
I was just going to ask that.
I mean, what did I see? I'll go to my grave never knowing what I saw. I'm fine with that.
Can you describe it for those who haven't heard it?
Yeah. I mean, we were looking down the end of the road, which is, I don't know, maybe 400, 300 yards down to the main road, and I saw a craft coming over the trees, and it was aligned a little bit to the right, because usually the craft's coming in to make a landing on the runway or to the left. It came over the trees, and it was going slow, and it was kind of cigar-shaped and kind of foggy, and then they got over my head, and I could see a hatch on the bottom. But I always had this disconnect from the time I was looking at it, and I remember thinking to myself, wow, this is incredible. Built this in, you'll never see nothing like this again in your life, I mean, I knew what I was looking at, I knew it was awesome. And, but there's a disconnect between when I was looking at it and then it was over to the right. It was just a couple seconds where I just don't remember it going from over my head to the right. So could that be, everybody goes, oh, you were taken by aliens. Oh, okay, well, maybe they needed to change a hologram image for a second. I don't know. You know what I mean?
But there was no sound.
No, there was no sound. Yeah. So what is the truth? I mean, look at the Flat Earth program going on right now, which was started by 4chan, I believe. I mean, the public so easily manipulated. It's not.
Oh yeah, 4chan's done some amazing things in their time.
I love 4chan; they're great.
Okay, well, we're burning up the hour here. I wanted to give Nick a chance to talk about his website, his blog, the books, where people can find out more. Go for it, Nick.
Well, all my books are available on Amazon, and about 60% of them you can get off the shelves in Barnes & Noble. And if people want to contact me, I've got a blog called World of Whatever, and so if you just type in Nick Redfern World of Whatever. It'll take you to the blog, and you can contact me there. I'm always happy to chat with people if they've got questions or want to share information or experiences, and also people can reach me at Twitter, Nick Redfern UFO, so I'm easily, or hopefully easily, contactable.
Very good. Steve is a man of mystery. I don't know how much you want to reveal about...
No, actually, you know what? This past year, Paul, I've just kind of decided to put myself out in the public eye a little more and stuff.
Oh, good.
I've just gotten a lot of my ghosts from the past that are put to bed, let's put it that way.
It can be therapeutic.
So, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, in a therapeutic way, not literally.
So can people contact you, or not
yeah,
quite there
yeah.
yet?
As a matter of fact, I've got a YouTube channel I'm getting going. It's called the Roland Hunson Project.
Oh, yes.
.com.
Right, yeah.
And that's got some goofy stuff on it, just me acting and doing
Okay.
goofy stuff.
And you can
But
always...
I'm going to expand that.
Yeah.
So,
you can always contact Steve through us, through the show.
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so let's. I wanted to talk about the Mothman case a little bit of the 1960s in the Ohio Valley. The press called it the Mothman, sort of a bat-like, human-like figure that was seen flying and doing all sorts of interesting things and scaring the daylights out of the local population. And there were other things too that were going on, Men in Black and ghosts and UFOs and you name it. We've been down there interviewing. We interviewed some witnesses and done a lot of research over the years, and it's really, really quite extensive. As I'm sure Nick too is familiar with this, and so is Steve. So the question is, it has come up in our own interviews with people that many of the Men in Black, or things that were interpreted as Men in Black, were really government agents who were concerned that the Soviets might have been behind the whole Mothman phenomenon. Did any of you have any information on that?
No, I don't. No.
Okay. All right. Well, all right. Maybe we...
Well, that was easy.
yeah. Maybe we know more than most people are. We asked the question, but yeah, we'll keep you fellows in the loop on that. There was just some suspicion. A couple of people have been on the show, and people we've spoken with privately who thought that there probably might have been a serious concern about that on the part of the government, whether it was legitimate or not. In that case, again, primarily 1966, 1967, but it still does kind of go on.
Well, I guess, this kind of begs the question that, with our sort of discussion of mass hysteria and public opinion changing, especially with the internet nowadays, but kicking it back like 50, 60 years, we see that there was a lot of sort of hysteria around flying saucers, even with something like the old War of the Worlds broadcast or whatever that was.
Thinking of that.
Yeah, exactly. That, even if it's something like, a modern version of that, which is essentially 4chan, changing public opinion through stupid little twists. What is the likelihood that a majority of, the flying saucer stuff in the 50s, the 40s and 50s, how much of that would we be able to point to and say, this is, Soviet or military interference, and this is actually extraterrestrial? Could the change in how UFOs have changed from, flying saucers to basically balls of light, is that some sort of evidence we can point to?
Well, that's a good question, because for the most part, the data that I have is that the Russians were sort of spreading rumors and stories and fabricating bogus documents in relation to UFOs, and that's easy to do, but I haven't really come across many reports where someone's claimed, that the Russians literally built, a flying saucer as a means to convince people that aliens, were invading. But what I have heard is that the Russians were working throughout the Cold War on programs involving radar, where they could sort of distort images on radar screens to create sort of bogus images that aren't actually real. In other words, the plan would be to sort of have U.S. intelligence radar operators seeing things on their screens which actually weren't there. That's about the closest, I can come to in terms of, sort of, I won't say hardware because that's the wrong word, but it's the closest thing I can think of that comes to like hardware and something actually, going beyond documents and rumors and that kind of thing.
Okay, we only have a minute or two left, but I wanted to get to the question of the involvement of the KGB, if any, with the MJ-12 documents. And maybe, Nick, you could explain just briefly what the MJ-12 documents are and whatever connection there may have been with some sort of Soviet influence, if any.
Yeah, I've actually got a couple of chapters on MJ-12 and the Russians in the book. And for people who don't know, MJ-12 is allegedly this sort of top-secret group hidden or buried deep within the U.S. Government, and which supposedly oversees things like the Roswell crash and the dead alien bodies and that kind of thing. And supposedly the group was created in the late 1940s in the aftermath of Roswell. And over the years, a number of so-called leaked documents from this group have been put into the public domain. The big question is, are these documents real or are they not? One of the things I found out was that the FBI had, when the documents surfaced in the late 80s, the FBI had concerns that the documents were not just the work of some kid in his basement, that scenario, and they did that, but they also didn't believe the documents were real, and they got it into their head, had this intriguing, interesting theory that the MJ-12 documents were actually created by the Russians. And the reason was because in that time frame, 87, 88, when the documents surfaced, there were worries within U.S. intelligence that there were people in U.S. intelligence who may actually have been working with the Russians. They'd been turned, they'd been blackmailed because there was something in their background, that kind of thing. And so the theory was that the Russians were saying to these people they turned, well, you get us a bunch of material and data on, let's say, the stealth bomber, and we'll send you some really cool documents on crashed UFOs. And supposedly this happened on several occasions where... Nick,
I'm afraid I have to stop you. We're just about out of time, but we'll keep the thought. We'll go to another show for this. And
all right, it'll work.
Thank you so much for being with us. It's always a great pleasure. And Steve, our good friend, hopefully you can come down to the studio next time, but thank you for your tremendous input, and I hope you feel better.
All right, thanks. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
All right. So let's go to our announcements here. First of all, a happy solstice that was yesterday to those who marked that, and a happy Hanukkah to our Jewish friends. That starts this evening, the Festival of Lights, and a very Merry Christmas, which starts on Wednesday. And yes, starts. Historically, Christmas is a 12-day feast that starts on December 25th, honoring the birth of Christ. No idea what day he was actually born, but that was deliberately blended with the Feast of Sol Invictus, the Romans, and we've talked about that on a lot of shows. And ending on Epiphany or Theophany on January 6th. That has nothing to do with wise men. It honors the baptism of Christ. So next time you hear the carol, the 12 Days of Christmas, pay attention. Anyway, we look forward to 2020, our lecture season. Our first event will be in April. Kid or Remain. We'll keep you posted on that.
So you can check out our books, including Behind the Paranormal, Everything You Know Is Wrong, and Behind the Paranormal 2, Bigfoot, Mothman, and Monsters You've Never Heard Of. And now, Dancing Past the Graveyard, Poltergeist, Parallel Worlds, Poltergeist, Parasites, Parallel Worlds, and God. And they're available from online retailers and in some stores, but for autographed copies, please visit the online website at BehindTheParanormal.com.
And that book, forward by Nick Redfern, our guest today. Check out, again, BehindTheParanormal.com. There's all kinds of information. There are links to several charities as well, and we ask you to check those out, including the Milk Fund locally here in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. That has a link to the station here, and you can check it out that way. Okay, so, Ben, what do we have in the fridge for next week?
So, in the fridge, ready for warming up on Sunday, December 29th, we will bring you an open line show to catch up on all of those questions from listeners on many paranormal subjects, and the guest co-host will be Shane Searway, and he will be back with us.
Very good. And we'll leave it this afternoon with a sobering thought from American author Ray Bradbury, great science fiction writer. Mysteries abound where most we seek for answers. Did we use that same quote last week? I thought we didn't get to it last week.
I don't know.
Okay. Well, we'll have to look back, and we will be.
We'll find out.
Really. But again, thanks to our special guest co-host today, Steve Laplume, and also our wonderful guest, Nick Redfern. Anyway, I'm Paul Eno.
I'm Ben Eno, and thanks for joining us on a great cosmic journey, and we shall see you behind the paranormal.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for